Hi to everyone tuning in on Zoom, and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. I'm Robin Browne, your co-host for this month's Off the Hill, and I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Unfortunately, my co-host Libby Davies is unable to join us tonight due to the poor weather conditions on the East Coast interfering with her internet. So we miss Libby, but hope to have her back next month. This evening, we're asking the question, how will the election year in the United States affect us in Canada? Our panelists will dive into the explosive world of US politics and discuss the many ways our southern neighbors influence what happens here in Canada. So tonight, we're very pleased to be joined by a member of Parliament for Timmins-James Bay, Charlie Angus, senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Stuart Trew, and Rabble editor, Nick Seebruch. Unfortunately, Carl Nuremberg, Rabble's parliamentary reporter and regular panelist for Off the Hill, could not be with us tonight. We did expect Al Jones, who's a poet, activist, professor, to join us, and we're thinking she may be having some difficulties, but hopefully she'll be able to join us. Well, there are many stark distinctions between Canada and the US, including the horrifying number of guns and weapons in the US, which far outweigh the number of people. Another key difference is that Canada has a tighter, more transparent voting system. But both countries also share similarities that are often obscured by the narrative that frames Canada as fundamentally kinder and gentler than the US. However, both countries share histories of slavery and Indigenous genocide that manifest today as systemic anti-Black and anti-Indigenous discrimination. Whether we're talking differences or similarities, there's no denying, though, that what happens south of the 49th parallel deeply impacts Canada, from politics to the economy to culture and global reputation. So to begin our conversation today, let's start with you, Charlie. As an MP, you have doggedly called out and exposed the rise of US-style right-wing politics in Canada, whether it's through the promotion of conspiracy theories, fake news, dog whistle politics, or voter manipulation. You said it's picking up the pace here in Canada. Tell us what you've been observing in the political arena and what we need to be aware of.
It's a really important question because we are going into deeply uncharted territory. And I will say, I was in the opposition benches for the entire Stephen Harper era. I saw these guys up close. What I'm seeing with the Pierre Poilievre crew is a different bunch, very different. And that's concerning. I'll frame it that in 2018, I was part of a parliamentary committee looking into political interference from disinformation. That was the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And it was the first time and the only time in my entire political career where Liberals, Conservatives, New Democrats all worked together, because we saw this threat as hugely potentially damaging. We worked internationally. We launched this the international parliamentary investigation into Facebook and manipulation of democratic processes. But I don't think what we understood was that as we were thinking of this as an exterior threat, our own brains and our own society was being rapidly rewired. And that's the thing we're dealing with now. What is driving conspiracy? Is it this outside threat from the United States, or is it politicians picking up on what's happening within our own society in Canada? I think we have to really look at how alienation conspiracy is being driven actually from the grassroots and then being reflected and verified and augmented by the front bench of the Pierre Poilievre caucus. The difference between Poilievre and Harper, in a nutshell, is that Harper kept the real crazies on the back bench. Poilievre seems to have decided that putting them on the front bench is really the ticket to success in the next election. And whether or not it is speaks volumes about how much Canada and the United States, I think, are in very, very treacherous waters right now.
Thanks a lot, Charlie. Stuart, let's go to you. In your role at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, you pay close attention to massive economic influences and domination from the US. What are the key economic issues this election year, and how could they affect Canadians?
Well, thanks, Robin. It's a pretty big question. I mean, there's a lot of economic issues, I would say, that definitely affect Canada. mainly because of how integrated we are, right? How integrated the Canadian economy is with the US economy. I'm going to focus on two of them, and I would encourage you, Robin, to just cut me off if you think I'm going too long. Because I focus on trade policy at the CCPA, I'm going to look at that first, and then I'd like to consider some of these nascent decarbonization efforts of the Biden administration. I think those are two areas where one where it may be less concern and one where there's quite a bit of concern from my perspective. Trade obviously always is high on the political agenda in the United States. I mean, people here in Canada where polls consistently show, 80% support for new trade agreements, may be surprised or maybe not that, most Americans or a large portion of them are very skeptical of the free trade agenda still. People might have recall that even Obama, right, back in the day, as part of his campaign in 2008, had to promise that he would renegotiate NAFTA if he was elected. Something, of course, he didn't do, and he kind of went right into these major NAFTA plus negotiations with the Trans-Pacific Partnership in Europe, for example. Anyway, we all kind of know since then, kind of coming back to closer to the present, that Trump gets this reputation as the big disruptor of that agenda, and I think to a large extent he deserves that. We know the tariffs he threw up on almost all Chinese imports, very high tariffs. We got hit by tariffs in Canada too on steel and aluminum. There's the anyway, essentially he kind of disrupted this trade agenda. But I think the point I'd like to make is that where trade, we hear in Canada a lot from certain establishment voices that we should be really worried about a Trump win because of the potential to disrupt Canadian trade. I think we should have to realize that this agenda is kind of bipartisan now in the United States. There's been a real shift in both parties. Many aspects of the trade policy they're in complete agreement on, whether it's, that trade should be worker-centered, for example. And of course, there's differences in what that might mean between the parties. There's an agreement, for better or worse, that, China is a strategic enemy of the United States and that they should be taking whatever means they can to decouple from China and encourage more of what's being produced there to be produced in the United States. I don't think we have to fully endorse these policies or agree with them entirely to kind of admit that they're a little bit interesting. And I think in some cases, especially the worker-centered trade innovations of the Biden administration, I think in some cases they're kind of refreshing, right? After years of being told that there is no other way other than these neoliberal standard free trade deals. I think just thinking, the tariffs is important in the sense that would we get hit by this broad wall of tariffs Trump is promising to put on all countries or a large number of countries is if elected? I think it's interesting to consider. I suspect it's probably not going to be the case. We have to consider that Trump actually negotiated the new NAFTA that we have now, the USMCA, and is unlikely to do something that would violate that. At least I think he is. A much bigger economic question mark for me, Robin, is with huge implications for our economy is this fate of the green transition or whatever you want to call it. Like we can debate how effective Biden's measures have been, right? If we look at things like the Inflation Reduction Act, the subsidies for electric vehicle manufacturing, it's definitely not the green New Deal the progressives wanted in the United States. It's not the Build Back Better package that would have substantially expanded American public services, healthcare, and social safety net and green infrastructure. Nonetheless, it is an honest attempt to decarbonize, lower emissions, and bring back some innovative manufacturing to the United States, right? I think Trump, like Poilievre here in Canada, is blaming that kind of government action, which has, I think, a lot of beneficial potential, is blaming it for the inflationary shock, right? As we've seen here in Canada over the past few years, totally unsubstantiated. And in order to get elected, on the backs of legitimate concerns about cost of living, and then to just go back to a very standard pro-corporate Republican conservative playbook, which is going to be deregulation, government cutbacks, making earlier Trump tax cuts permanent, and drilling, right? Drilling for more oil and gas, right? Or kind of falling back on fossil fuels. So I think that's what I'm worried about. And I'm worried about in the sense that it has the potential to undercut or like swipe the knees out of Canada's own moves in that direction, right? Its own transition in terms of EV supply chains. we supply the American market, right, for automobiles. And if there's any disruptions to that transition as it goes, it's going to have implications for jobs here. The flip side is also the case, right? So it's complicated because what is Trump going to do? Is he going to say, well, these measures, these subsidies are actually successfully kind of undermining the competitiveness, of Chinese electric vehicle manufacturing, and we're going to go along with them, right? Or is he going to actively work against that in order to benefit like big oil and get us back onto gas guzzlers and that kind of thing? The other question is, if he does support it, is he going to go, even further and say, well, we don't agree that you should be including Canada and Mexico as allied nations for the purpose of benefiting from the subsidies. We want all of the manufacturing to take place in the United States. So we're actually going to start pointing fingers and saying, like we want your whatever it is, Northvolt or other investments. Honda, for example, investing in Canadian gigafactory. We expect some of that money to come into the United States. So anyway, either way, there's questions that I think the government needs to be asking, preparing for, and preparing in close consultation, I would think, with private sector unions. But I'll leave it there for now, and maybe there's some questions later.
Excellent. No, thank you, Stuart. No, no, I let you go a little longer there because it's good to get the breakdown on the economic stuff. So, Nick, let's bring you in as Rabble's editor. You've kept a close eye on American politics. You recently wrote a Rabble article on conservative MP Leslie Lewis's U.S.-influenced anti-UN United Nations petition. So as a journalist, what changes are you seeing in Canada with the rise of right-wing politics and the links to US politics?
Yeah, well, this falls on very well to Charlie's earlier comments of seeing, more extreme politicians move from the back conservative benches further to the front. Leslie Lewis isn't a backbench conservative MP. She's Pierre Poilievre's shadow minister for infrastructure. This petition that she's circulating and she's putting forth in Parliament is a good recent example of the growth of unfounded conspiracy theories in Canada that are directly influenced from the US. The man who co-wrote this petition that Lewis presented is putting forth these theories about how the UN is part of a secret plan to commit genocide in the year 2030 and change human DNA and all sorts of crazy stuff. His group, Prevent Genocide 2030, was co-founded with an American doctor who was throwing around alternative COVID cures during the pandemic. So you're seeing really direct connections between the far right extreme in the United States and it entering into Canada. And this isn't the first time in our recent history. We saw it during the Freedom Convoy as well. There was a heavy American influence on the Freedom Convoy. I was working for my local paper here in Cornwall, Ontario at the time. We received the leaked list of donors who gave to the convoy through the a right-wing Give, Send, Go app, and we saw a lot of local Canadian names here in this part of Eastern Ontario, but the biggest donors were in the States. So you have, again, there another direct connection of far-right interests in the United States entering into Canada, trying to influence our politics here in Canada. We also have examples of this coming up in the near future. Just this month, Tucker Carlson will be on stage in Edmonton, Alberta, alongside Jordan Peterson and Conrad Black. Tucker Carlson, well known for shopping when he was still at a job at Fox News in far-right conspiracy theories, in white supremacist rhetoric, in COVID conspiracy theories, all sorts of really awful far-right stuff that he's bringing to Alberta. I was a little bit gratified to know that they're having a very hard time selling tickets to that show. I understand that they're $800 a pop, and a donor has recently purchased around 3,000 of them that they're giving away for free. So, maybe the level of interest in Canada for what Tucker Carlson is selling is not quite there. But again, just another example of U.S. far-right politics trying to find a home and trying to find a route in Canada. And, in the US, I think how you saw the rise of Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson and other far right wing figures in the mainstream was it's happened over the course of decades. It started in the 1980s with the deregulation of fair and balanced news coverage. It's also been tied to the cutbacks in public education in the United States, done mostly by conservative governors in right-wing states. And Canada isn't quite there yet in terms of that kind of far-right media landscape. We don't really have anything in Canada that you could really say is like a Fox News or even like a Newsmax, even as much as Ezra Levant and his outfit would like to claim to be. But that isn't to say that we're not free from danger. We're not free from getting there. I think you're seeing, I think, more far right wing and extremist rhetoric in a lot of post media newspapers. Also, we are seeing, much like in the States, a weakening of public institutions, and especially a weakening of legitimate, independent news media. News media that reports without bias, with integrity. Support rabble.ca, by the way, rabble.ca/donate. But just this week, or maybe it was late last, a poll done by Heritage Canada was covered, I believe, in the Globe and Mail, that showed that Canadians responding to this poll had weakening faith in all public institutions, whether it was municipal, provincial, or federal government, and it also included news media. This is a worrying trend. We could see ourselves sliding further into a place where, like in the States, it's post-truth, it's media silos where people are only getting their news from one specific source, and they can be, if you're only getting your news from one specific source, and that source is manipulating you, it leads to what you see in the United States.
No, thanks, Nick. No. All right. So a question to all of you now. We've kind of focused a lot on the negatives, right? The negative thing that from America that influence Canada. But are there positives also? So I want to get each of your thoughts on that. So why don't we reverse the order and go Nick, and then Stuart, and then Charlie.
You're keeping me on my toes tonight, Robin. Positives, yeah, of course. Much like there is, cross pollination on the far right, I think there is also opportunities for cross pollination on the left. And I don't think it was coincidental that in 2023 you saw a great year for unions in Canada and in the United States. I think that the labor movement in particular, cross the border, is very, very strong right now. I think maybe it is even feeding off of each other. I hope that, and we're seeing unions really at the forefront of the fight against a lot of this far right-wing rhetoric. And we saw it in the late summer and early fall of 2023 with the so-called 1 Million March for Children, which was another far right-wing movement shopping conspiracies and anti-transphobic, anti-2S LGBTQIA plus rhetoric. And to me, the people who I saw out there the most pushing back against this form of hate were unionized workers. It was CUPE Ontario. It was the Ontario Federation of Labor. It was the ETFO. It was the OSSTF. It was these teachers' unions, and all sorts from across the length and breadth of labor came out onto Parliament Hill, into communities across this country, to stand up against far-right rhetoric. And I think that they were able to do that because of the strength of the labor movement right now. We saw major gains, especially in the auto industry, for unionized workers in 2023. We saw that both in Canada and the United States. And I think that is one example of a positive traffic going both ways across the border in terms of political support.
Thank you, Stuart.
Okay, Robin. Yeah, when you sent this question, I thought about it. It's kind of like asking if there's anything good about getting pneumonia. I'm sure there are benefits, but I couldn't think of them immediately. But then I guess thinking back to the presentation on economics and the economic impacts and that kind of thing. I don't know if people saw Prime Minister Trudeau claimed yesterday that in relation to Trump's win in the Iowa primaries that one of Canada's greatest strengths when dealing with Washington, whoever's there, is how integrated our two economies are. He said it's something that governments have smartly worked on for decades, and I thought it was quite an amazing and puzzling thing to say. If we were less integrated, surely events in politics, right, in the U.S. would have less of an effect on us. But in any case, I think as a result of that economic integration, when U.S. governments start doing things, good or bad, it has good or bad effects on us, right? So like canceling transborder oil pipelines, like Keystone XL, or making auto emissions or consumer product energy efficiency rules more stringent. That's kind of a boring example, but or demanding that the government deal with far right protests, right, blocking trade routes across the border. I mean, we didn't do, as far as I can tell, Canada didn't really seriously move to do anything about those protests until it was, the governor of Michigan, right, and Washington to say we should be acting on that. It has, obviously, there's the opposite effect too. I mean, in the Bush era, I'm thinking back to the deregulation around rail transportation, right, that directly led to the Lac Mégantic explosion of July 2013, because what does Canada do? Well, we mimic the regulations. So there's some extreme negatives of that as well. But I think at the current moment, just to go back to what I was saying earlier, if you have an administration seemingly committed to meeting climate objectives for the first time, I don't know, ever, putting money into reshoring certain high value added good sectors, infrastructure that's been degraded, putting money into that, that's just necessarily automatically going to benefit Canadian exports, and that's going to have a positive effect on jobs. I'm not saying it's an unqualified benefit. Like, I'm thinking, like, where's the social license necessarily, for example, for expanding mining, critical minerals exploration in order to feed that U.S. renewal, if that's in fact where we're going. So it's not an uncritical benefit, but just to say that there are benefits. And then the last thing I'll say, because Nick was talking about cross-border civil society connections, that's absolutely critical and always a benefit for us. And we're currently working with U.S. and Mexican groups right now on a dispute that's been raised under the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement against Mexico's genetically engineered corn decrees from earlier in 2023. Very positive policy, very much responding to concerns around biodiversity of Mexican corn, indigenous methods of growing and raising corn that go back centuries, more than that, millennia. And Canada and the U.S. ganging up, right, and challenging Mexico on this in the dispute settlement system. So we're working to kind of push back against that within, through submissions to the panel, and also to kind of draw attention to that. And it's a very, very beneficial thing to have those transborder connections. Absolutely.
Well, let's put it in perspective. Canada is a petrostate. We have a charter of rights and freedoms that exists as long as everyone agrees that we're going to provide charter of rights and freedoms to everyone, or any two-bit loser right-wing premier can override people's constitutional rights based on scoring points, as we've seen in Saskatchewan on the issue of trans rights. I think Canada, I'm just going to say it bluntly, Canada always pats itself on the back because we live next door to our crazy neighbors. As long as they're a little crazier than us, then we're the model of decorum. But mediocrity is not a vision for a nation. And Canada skips by saying nice things and being a petrostate. So compare us to what Biden has done, and we're not even in the game. Biden went to COP26. He said he was going to create a new economy based on good paying union jobs. And I've said this because I'm on the negotiations with the Liberals on sustainable jobs. I've sat at meeting after meeting and said, I've never, ever heard Justin Trudeau ever use the word good paying union jobs. Justin Trudeau and Chrysler Freeland are the last of the globalization free traders. They believe this because this is what they grew up with. So they had no vision for creating a sustainable economy based on good paying union jobs. Joe Biden pushed the IRA. What has happened with the IRA has been a complete transformation that's underway right now in terms of clean energy, in terms of jobs, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of new jobs being created. I talk to people in industry. I talk to people in the mining sector. They're like, man, we're looking to the States. That's where it's happening. What do we get?
Charlie, what's the IRA?
Yeah, the IRA are not my cousins in Ireland. The Inflation Reduction Act. The
Gotcha, okay.
Inflation Reduction Act was how Biden had to sell clean energy to get it through Congress.
Okay.
So you're looking at massive clean energy projects off the coast of Atlantic Canada, or off the Atlantic in Martha's Vineyard, New England. I mean, these are power projects that are heating like 800,000 homes, 400,000 homes. We're still talking about it. You know, Justin Trudeau went to COP26 and said we were going to get we were going to meet our global emissions targets. We've missed every single emissions target. Canada is the outlier of the G7. We failed on every target. So in my day job, is to negotiate with the Liberals as part of our agreement on this. And we just keep pointing, look what the States is doing. When the States decided to do it, they put all a government approach. They put people in, Biden put people in who actually knew how to get through things in Congress. Justin Trudeau puts out press releases. So we are nowhere in the game on clean energy the way the United States has moved. And we also then have to deal with premiers like Danielle Smith, who chased maybe $15 billion of clean energy investment out of Alberta over ideology. And let's just get this on the agenda. There's no place in Canada that has the potential to create clean energy the way Alberta. Alberta is so far out in front in terms of its industry, in terms of its investors, but you've got a premier that believes the world is flat. So we're dealing with conspiracy in Saskatchewan. We're dealing with conspiracy in Alberta. We had Doug Ford, who ripped up all the EV charging plants and then turned around, or the EV charging stations, and turned around and said we were going to be the battery economy of the world. Canada needs to get its act together. And I look at what Biden's managed to do, and Biden has put all of government approach. So that's when I'm negotiating with the Liberals. I keep saying, man, you either get in the game or Canada's sitting on the sidelines. The United States is moving ahead in a lot of really interesting areas. There are fundamental differences between our countries, but there are some areas that are similar. And I think the threat, and this is why I'm really concerned, is that our social networks are being rewired to conspiracy the same way our American cousins are. And that's what we have to start to disentangle. How are we also getting caught up in conspiracy? How is it possible that you could have a premier in an energy state like Alberta promoting obvious falsehoods in an economy that will benefit more than any other part of the country in terms of clean energy? Even Texas, I mean, Texas, for crying out loud, is gone to clean energy in a massive way, and we still are limping along in Canada arguing about it because of we're a petro state and because we haven't brought that full of government approach. So I'm looking at what's happening south of the border on this, and it's like, man, they're kicking our ass. So there are real positives, but the toxicity of the Trump and conspiracy is what we have to address at all levels.
Thanks a lot, everybody, to all you folks for all the answers. We've got actually a lot of time now for audience questions. So audience folks, if you have questions you want to send in, we've got some coming in already. But actually, we're going to start off with, although Carl, like I say, Nuremberg is not with us, he is here in spirit. And so Carl recently wrote a piece called "What Can Democrats Do to Stop Trump?" And we were wondering, and we want to go again from each of the panelists to answer, what can Canadians do to prepare for Trump in case he's elected? So why don't we go Stuart, Charlie, Nick?
I honestly don't know. What can we do to prepare? Obviously, we don't have a lot of control, right? We don't have a lot of say over what happens there. I mean, I was trying to get out of my presentation the ways in which it might, whoever wins, right? Hopefully, we don't have to come to that situation where Trump wins. A lot of, uncertainty around whether he gets to that point anyway. But what can we do to prepare? I'm going to defer and think about it, if that's okay. I'm going to throw it to the next person because I honestly don't know.
Brown. We'll throw that one to Charlie. Charlie, you want to try that one?
Well, in terms of the economics, I'm not as concerned. I mean, I don't think Trump really cares too much about the economy. I think he's got other battles he's fighting. He's got his vindictive fight against the Justice Department, against the courts. What worries me is the destabilizing of America, because as much as us younger cousins really like to blame America for everything, we live in their shadow. And a destabilized America is not a good way to be at a time of real global crisis. That's my concern. My concern is that it will certainly influence more extremist movements in Canada, and Pierre Poilievre certainly has shown a complete willingness to play to extremism in Canada. So our own institutions, I think, are going to be very challenged. They're probably not coming for the Supreme Court, but you could know that they'll shut down CBC on day one of a conservative government. But I was in Berlin a year ago, November, at the midterms, and we were meeting with the Social Democratic government there. Jagmeet Singh, our leader, was there, and there was this really strange black cloud hanging over our meetings, and it was the U.S. midterms. Most people in Europe, when you go on these parliamentary things, it's like Canada. I had a cousin there once. He went to Vancouver. Would you know him? Or they'll say, it's cold there, isn't it? And then they'll go and talk about the United States. Canada isn't a player on the world stage. When we were in Europe, they were paying a lot of attention to Canada because the fear of a destabilized, undemocratic America is freaking Europe out, as particularly as we see Putin, as we see China. And the meetings we were having the whole time, our German counterparts were paying attention to the American midterms. So Canada is going to have to find itself allies in the world. We're going to have to find a place to maintain democratic values, to maintain progressive values if Trump comes in, because we're going to see chaos factor there. So I'm not so much worried about what's coming over the border in terms of tariffs. He's going to do what he's going to do, but we've had protectionist tariff stuff happening no matter what the government, but it's really going to come if America pulls out and descends into chaos and possibly violence, it's going to have a huge impact. And I just don't think we've really thought this thing through. We think we're just going to carry on the way we have, and we can't. We really need to start building those international relations and build more credibility, which I don't think Canada has on the international stage at this time.
And just
Thanks,
to build,
Charlie. Nick, yeah, go
on
ahead.
what Charlie said, I think this question really gets to the heart of what we're talking about here tonight, the influence of U.S. politics on Canada. The rise of Donald Trump is not unique inside the United States. We're seeing a rise of far-right politics across the world in many countries. We saw in Europe a far-right politician gain the most votes in their last election. We're seeing far-right party, the far-right AfD in Germany gain more and more votes. And more support. We're seeing our own former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, going around the world trying to create closer ties with far-right political parties like Viktor Orban, like the parties in the Netherlands and in Germany. And this is not, like I said, this is not just the United States. Canada will not be immune to seeing a rise in far-right rhetoric, I think, if Donald Trump gets a second term in the White House. And going back to what I spoke about earlier, it's important to be vigilant about what your right-wing politicians are saying. It's important to be well versed in media literacy and understanding the arguments that are being put out there. Pierre Poilievre right now, he's really pushing this slogan of common sense conservatism, c'est le gros bon sens in French. To me, that just kind of says, don't ask me too much about my policies. Maybe he doesn't have any he wants to share, or maybe he just doesn't want to be asked about some of these far right-wing things that some of his shadow ministers are saying. Charlie also mentioned conservative premiers. It's at all levels. We should be questioning what these leaders are doing. Danielle Smith they're doing a lot of this performative stuff. The petition, in a way, that Leslie Lewis is putting forward is performative. I'm starting to feel that a lot of conservative politicians in the House are seeing question period as a way to drive traffic on social media, to create clips to share on Instagram, to feed the base, to get them to rage farm, to get engagement, all of those things. And just talking about Danielle Smith, she had last year the Tylenol scandal, which is still in the news today, of last year when there was a shortage on child Tylenol. She went to Turkey and got substandard Tylenol. She spent $100 million on it. It didn't even have the proper childproof caps. And when it finally arrived, now it's all expired. But she was willing to spend $100 million taxpayer dollars in order to so-called own the left, own the libs, just to make a statement and feed her base. And I think this is something that we'll have to remain vigilant for, whether or not Donald Trump wins another term in the White House. But if he does, I think expect to see that turned into overdrive of Pierre Poilievre, Danielle Smith, Doug Ford, all doing these performative things to get their base angry, because they know if they stay angry, they stay engaged with them.
Yeah, could I just jump in too, Robin, and follow up?
Go ahead. Yes.
I just listening to Charlie and Nick, I was thinking back to what Canada might do. I think Charlie's absolutely right. I mean, you hear it almost everywhere that Canada's standing internationally is dim. It's significantly depleted. I think Canada, needs to stop acting like what it basically is, which is, a sidekick, right, to the United States. And it does need to start really flexing some kind of independent foreign policy. That's going to involve, I think, a little bit more understanding of where other countries are at. Certainly in the trade world, we see Canada playing a very standard, traditional neoliberal role, pushing the same old models down, negotiations into areas a lot of developing countries, very powerful countries, don't want to go. We see Canada, like I was saying before, and the United States currently just badgering Mexico, in a number of ways, on whether it's with respect to the AMLO government's energy policy, which is, focused on the public sector and not privatization, or its food sovereignty measures like this genetically engineered corn measure. We need to see Canada seeing where it has things in common with countries like Mexico in terms of, we want to protect our supply management system. Maybe their system serves the same purpose for their farmers, right? So, when you have an uncertain situation in the United States, potential, wrecking ball coming back in there, you need global allies, and Canada currently doesn't have any, right? Because it's not thinking in terms of solidarity with other countries. It's always thinking in terms of its role and what it can do to further the objectives of whoever's been in Washington at the time. So independence for sure, and a little bit more understanding of the situations of other countries that don't happen to be within the G7 orbit.
Excellent. All right. Here's another audience question. We can't deny that a lot of media and government has proved unworthy of our trust. So how can we be critical of those failures without adopting the language and framing of the alt-right? Anyone can jump in on that one.
That's a really important question. And I think one of the difficulties is that on social media, our ability to have more substantive conversations, it's disappearing, because we're based on reaction. And we were talking today, some of us, about what happened in COVID, and I think COVID changed everything. COVID radicalized the population where there was no radicalization before. I see that in my region of working class people who never paid attention to politics, and suddenly they were spouting stuff at me at record speed, of like World Economic Forum stuff that they hadn't heard of the day before, and then suddenly everyone heard of it. They had pulled out of national media sources. They weren't listening to CTV and CBC. They were on Reddit forums. They were on 8chan. These are like rural people that I know who never paid attention to. So if you say there's a problem with the vaccine, how do you have that conversation in a pandemic without then creating this massive disinformation fallout? And I think it's really difficult. I mean, CBC is, I think, a really weakened, challenged, mediocre failure right now. But what do I say about it? Do I attack it for the fact that it is not being the voice that it used to be? Because Poilievre's going to shut it down. And once it's shut down, we're in a really different zone. When you pull out a national broadcaster and kill it, we are in a really difficult zone. So I might disagree with the commentary on CBC. I might disagree with its vision, but what happens if it goes down? I think we're in really challenged times because you're dealing with political arsonists, and we haven't dealt with that in Canada in the past. We've seen it in the United States over the last 25 years, political arson as a way of winning points. In Canada, people have tended to pull back. And I will say, Aaron O'Toole, who I thought was a really smart guy. I didn't agree with him, but Aaron O'Toole's last speech in the House of Commons is worth listening to. He was warning Canadians about what happens when you swing for the algorithms. He was trying to tell Canadians that basically the people behind him would stab him in the back and taken him down as political leader. That they were chasing the disinformation, because the disinformation fires, it's like moonshine for politicians, man. It's nothing better to get drunk on getting people raved up. It's really hard to be in a situation where we don't have those common ways to discuss what are the problems and what are the solutions when we're dealing with amped up rhetoric, amped up Twitter, amped up disinformation, and it puts us into opposing silos that we may not otherwise be. And that, I think, is the real difficulty of politics in Canada right now. People who normally could have found common ground have a real hard time to find common ground, and they find it easier to not have common ground, to blame each other. And whether it's anything from, medical to the economy to Gaza, like we're burning each other up. We're burning our neighbors up. We're burning our family up. We're burning our friends up. And it makes it really hard to find a path forward. I don't know how we step back from all that and say, what's the bigger vision of Canada? But I think that's the challenge in politics now. What's a vision that we can find some common ground to bring people into that conversation?
And just
go
to
ahead.
add on that, I'll say that if you want to see a change in your local media, because media is having a hard time right now, it's facing a lot of financial challenges, it's facing a lot of viability issues, with a business platform, no matter what their business platform is, and that's caused a degradation, I think, in quality across the board that Charlie was speaking to. And at the local level, I come from a background in local news. And if you want your local newspaper to pay attention, send them a letter. Send them a letter to the editor. If they have any integrity, they'll run it. And even if not, they'll take that feedback seriously. Whenever we here in Cornwall got a letter to the editor at our local paper, we were like, okay, this is what people care about. This is what people want to see. So if you're not, engaging with your local media, they're not going to be reflective of what you care about. So that would be one advice that I have. And you can also do it with national outlets, send letters, I'd say, to the National Post or to other larger newspapers to make sure that your voice is getting heard. Come out and say something, because, there was always a rule of thumb that if I'm getting one letter to the editor about this, how many other, dozens of people think the same thing, but just aren't saying anything. So I'd say if you want some news that you can use, don't forget about your local media, engage with them, be critical of them, hold them accountable, and I think you'll see differences in your local community, and that's some place to start.
No, thanks, Nick. Stuart, did you want to weigh in on how we can critique media and government without looking like we're too far on the right?
I don't know what more I could add. I was tempted to say something a little bit about organizing, right? What does successful organizing look like? But I'm a little bit out of my depth in that because I'm not an expert on organizing, but also it might be a little bit far from the question. But I did start thinking about what is the the separation of people in their own bubbles. I certainly don't consume CBC in large quantities or any major news source in large quantities. I get my information in kind of piecemeal fashion in sources I trust. I'm just assuming a lot of people are kind of the same boat. But, and this again may not be totally related, but looking at successful organizing in Quebec, whether it's against the oil sector and pipelines, or whether it's you look back to the student protests of the post financial crisis period. I mean, you really do have to come back to talking to people, door to door, basements, churches, that kind of thing. Like, human contact is more important than ever in this environment where we're in, where like a lot of young people just stare at their phones all day. Not just young people, but all of us stare at our phones all day. Anyway, like I said, not an expert, maybe rambling off topic, but the human contact side of this, the organizing, finding common ground. We've gone beyond education and getting messages out through media to having to resolve real conflicts, right, in our communities and in our families. This is like a conflict resolution kind of situation, and it's something that I think unions are one group that's very in a good position to do or to help do, but so are a lot of community organizing groups, right? I mean, that's where we have to maintain strength, and that's a good vaccine, in my opinion, against a lot of misinformation.
No, thanks. All right, another audience question. Conservative Party voters are often lumped in with far-right believers in Canada. What is Pierre Poilievre representing to those who don't identify with far-right beliefs, but are still staunch conservative supporters? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
Can you repeat the question for 200, Jack?
No problem. It's a long one. Yeah. So Conservative Party voters are often lumped in with far-right believers in Canada. What is Pierre Poilievre representing to those who don't identify with far-right beliefs, but are still staunch conservatives?
That's a really good question. It's a complex question. I think that Poilievre is speaking. We're dealing with a prime minister who is out of touch. I mean, Justin Trudeau is completely out of touch. It really worked in 2015. It doesn't work now. I mean, the fact that every January he's in another scandal off, in Jamaica or some island in the South Seas. Is it right? Is it wrong? I don't know. But this is not a guy who you feel who gets what you're dealing with at a time of high inflation, high job insecurity. The fact that people have been unable to live in the communities that they grew up in, precarious work. And this neoliberal model screwed us over. It totally screwed us over. I mean, we're looking at, all my daughters had to leave Toronto. They couldn't live there anymore. A city that I loved, they couldn't afford to live in. And so the liberal solution has always been a neoliberal, well, the market will deal with it. Well, we'll say nice things. Poilievre is playing to that anger. He's playing to that anger of people who feel that they've been screwed over. What I think is concerning and dangerous in the mix that he's playing with, which is almost like whether or not this is a kind of a political Molotov cocktail that's going to blow up. He is really seriously courting the extremist base, which is really frightening. But at the same time, he's speaking to people who are feeling economically insecure, and the blame game is big, and it's an underlying thing. So that blame game is going against immigration now. And so the xenophobia, the race thing is there. It's there because people are saying, well, God, all these people are coming into our country and I don't have a place to live. We don't have a national housing program. New Democrats have been fighting for it. New Democrats have been pushing this for a long time. But what we got a prime minister who's, I don't know how many announcements they've made about this accelerator fund for housing. So where the frick are these houses, right? So Poilievre is playing to economic insecurity, anger, and the fact that we have a prime minister who is out of touch. The danger is that this guy is not your friend. He's shown nothing about taking on the grocery giants. He's shown nothing about taking on big oil. He actually has no plan for dealing with the climate crisis other than making pollution free. So he's offering really simplistic and dangerously simplistic solutions, which is again what Trump did. And deconstructing that is going to take, I think, a very strong class-based response, something I'm hoping the Democrats will be able to do in that next election. But Poilievre, we cannot dismiss the people who are being brought into the Poilievre orbit just because the people that he's got up front in his caucus are actually representing some really bizarre, dangerous, extremist views. Poilievre's bringing a wake of a lot of disenfranchised people who just don't pay attention to politics, who don't watch CBC, who are watching just what their pocketbook says, and they're getting these short, bouncy clips from Poilievre of anger and rage. So is it going to work? I don't think at the end of the day it can work as a rage machine, but and I hope to God it doesn't, but it is this is a different political beast than normal conservative politics.
Well, thanks,
Exactly.
Nick.
And
Go ahead. Nick.
sorry, just jumping in, Robin. So, why does the conservative voter who doesn't like the transphobic rhetoric, who doesn't like the conspiracy theories, why are they still supporting Pierre Poilievre? Why is he leading in the polls right now? Well, let's go back to the central issue of this episode and compare it to the U.S. example. Why is Donald Trump leading Joe Biden in so many polls in the United States? After all the comments, the 91 felony charges, all of this stuff, the question is, where's the bottom? And I think media is part of the problem. Media silos, only getting information from one place, and I think a lack of engagement. I think with good news media, there seems to be this attitude of, like Charlie said, they're feeling it in their pocketbook, so they're going to try something else, and they think that I only have two choices. I have the liberals, I have the liberals, I have the conservatives. It's like the states, it's red or blue, just switched around. But I think we in media need to do a better job of encouraging people to and help them to do that homework of getting out of their media silo, of seeing the news that maybe they're not seeing. And it's harder now more than ever for news media to do that job because of Bill C-18, where we lost a huge amount of our reach from losing access to meta platforms where we used to get a lot of our traffic from. But I think that that speaks to part of the problem. If you look at Canada and the US, and why some people are voting for someone who they disagree with on the flashy stuff, the dark stuff, the conspiracy theories, the charges, the transphobic rhetoric, because like Charlie said, it's down to what they're feeling in their pocketbooks and what they're seeing, or rather what they're not seeing and not receiving through their news media.
Actually, I just wanted to actually get Stuart's view on this too, right? Because this question is essentially like they're asking, what is Pierre Poilievre offering to people who don't like his social, like kind of far right social conservatism, but like his economic conservatism. So, like economically, what is he presenting that obviously is connecting with a lot of people? Stuart, you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far as to say he's connecting, or the message is connecting with a lot of people, right? I mean, the polls seem to show that, but the polls might be indicating fatigue, right, with the Liberal government more than that. And I think we should keep in mind there is a numbers game here in terms of swing ridings in, say, like areas like the GTA, for example, where there are places that will go liberal and conservative back and forth. There's not necessarily a coherent vision, I think, and certainly there isn't in Trump. So if we think about what Trump does, Trump says whatever he wants, in any situation. He tries to be outlandish. He tries to stay in the media, preys on people's insecurities for sure. He preys on their narcissism as well. It's incoherent. It's not a project anyone would understand as necessarily, yes, this is the classic Republican project, but it does have that behind it, right? Trump is kind of a vessel for bringing a lot of that traditional Republican project back to the fore. And I think something similar is happening here in Canada, where like conservatives haven't been doing great in recent elections. There's split offs, right, from groups, the People's Party and others, who are disenchanted with conservatism. And so there is, there's that aspect of it. It doesn't have to be coherent. It just has to bring enough people back in from certain groups who maybe left to kind of get them over the numbers when they get to the point of the election. And it has to bank on, again, disinterest or people turning off of the liberals, right? When you come to the centrist, more conservative liberal voters, right? So, does it have to be coherent? No. Some people might even cynically be like okay with Poilievre going that route, simply because it's going to get them the numbers, right? To get them into office, right? I'm not saying I've seen, necessarily evidence of that, right, in anywhere, but just to say that there is the whole just crass electoral politics of it all, and that sometimes its incoherence is the point, right? It can actually, it has its own value. It has its own value for the party and for the message.
Thanks for that. All right, we're getting near the end, but we have one last, well, actually we have a few other audience questions, but we're going to do this one last one. And this actually was for you specifically, Nick, and you kind of touched on it already, but I want you to give us an answer. And I bet Charlie probably has some thoughts on this because of the work Charlie did in terms of disinformation. So the question is, Nick, could the legislation that is blocking all news media on Facebook and Instagram be having an impact on the rise of far-right beliefs in Canada?
Well, I think Bill C-18 is definitely having a negative impact on traditional news media, and which is, I think, giving room and space for these further out far-right conspiracy theories to and outlets to sort of take root and make more of a home for themselves. Facebook, Instagram, was traditionally a very large driver of traffic for news media. Losing that has had a significant negative effect on I think most news media outlets. I feel like the Liberal Party, when they went forward with this, they went forward with an idea that at its core I could agree with, because Facebook, Google was making money off of stuff that journalists like myself were producing and putting out there, but they did it in a way where we were the hostages left in the middle. We all of a sudden had the rug cut out from under us, and we felt we didn't really have any much recourse to protect ourselves. So I guess to answer your question, yeah, I think it's by causing more strain on traditional news media and independent news media that's out there. I think we have seen a space for people to start looking elsewhere, and maybe at places that don't have the integrity or the best interests of the public good in mind.
Thank you, Charlie. You got a minute.
Okay, well, very quickly, I mean, I think the biggest threats to democracy have been the platforms like Facebook and Google. They have viciously promoted through machine-driven AI, disinformation, conspiracy theory. YouTube is one of the main drivers of extremism. And then you get a country that tries to hold them accountable, and they squash local media. You're dealing with these entities that are now bigger than national governments. I think there was a need to hold Facebook and Google to make them pay. I think what they've done is they've decided to turn around and squash our local media, and I think it's having a disastrous impact. I think it's having a disastrous impact on conversation because people are now totally disengaged. But there is a bigger question: is how do we deal with this? And I think it has to be done internationally with parliamentary work and the EU, and that to actually make sure that platforms like Amazon, Facebook, and Google cannot just squash national law and squash regional markets, because they are so powerful and they are a major threat to democracy if there's not some rules in place.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, that's all the time we have for questions today. So thank you to all our wonderful guests, Charlie, Stuart, and Nick, for joining us today. Our live political panel, Off the Hill, will return next month. As a reminder, we now have a regular day set for the series, so you can join us for Off the Hill every third Wednesday of the month, every month, which means our next Off the Hill will happen February 21st. So be sure to get an invitation for that event by signing up for Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca/subscribe. And finally, a big thanks to Rabble for hosting events like this. To keep events like this going, please consider supporting Rabble by making a one-time donation, or even better, becoming a monthly donor at rabble.ca/donate. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we will see you next month.
Yep.